There comes a moment in history when the underdog rises, when the unheard speak, when the world turns its gaze, not to the mighty, but to the meek, and in that moment power is redefined, not by weapons, not by wealth, but by faith. This is the story of a people written off, a message dismissed, a desert land that dared to dream, and yet, what they built took down the greatest empires on earth. This isn't just history, it's a reminder: never underestimate the power of belief. Centuries ago, the Arabian Peninsula was not a place you'd look to for power or progress. It was barren, broken, and brutal. Tribes were locked in endless feuds over land, livestock, and long-held grudges. Life was hard, hope was scarce. People lived in cycles of vengeance, their pride tied to tribal lineage, their survival dependent on loyalty to blood rather than vision. In the eyes of the world, they were invisible, a footnote in the grand script of Roman and Persian glory. No one expected greatness to rise from there. No one looked to the desert for answers, and yet that's exactly where the tide began to turn, because sometimes change doesn't come from where it's expected. Sometimes the least likely become the most impactful, not because of their resources, not because of their numbers, but because of a shift deep within purpose. When the message of Islam first emerged, it wasn't just words, it was a lifeline. A divine calling that reached into the broken hearts of a forgotten people and said, "You matter, you are not lost, you are chosen." That was radical, that was revolutionary. Suddenly, the poor, the enslaved, the outcast, all found themselves seen, heard, called to something higher than their pain, higher than their past. They weren't being invited to power for the sake of pride. They were being awakened to purpose, and that purpose changed everything. People who once fought over goats and grudges began to live for something eternal. They began to believe that their lives weren't accidents of geography, but instruments of destiny, that every moment of patience, every act of mercy, every step toward truth carried meaning beyond this world. And when people discover meaning, real, soul, deep meaning, they become powerful in ways no empire can measure. They started treating each other differently, not just as allies in blood, but as brothers and sisters in belief. And it wasn't perfect. It was messy. It took time, but it was happening. The message gave them structure, values, and identity. It gave them a reason to wake up before dawn, a reason to forgive when revenge would have been easier, a reason to rise even when the odds screamed stay down. What fueled them wasn't ego, it was something deeper, a sense that they were part of a divine plan woven into something far bigger than themselves. Purpose made them bold, purpose made them patient, purpose made them dangerous to those who held power by fear. Because once you ignite the heart with belief, it doesn't stay small. It doesn't stay silent. It spreads. And when it spreads, it begins to shake everything that once seemed untouchable. The Romans had swords. The Persians had palaces. But the Muslims had conviction. They had purpose. And that purpose burned hotter than the desert sun, lighting fires in hearts that no empire could extinguish. They were fragmented, scattered like pieces of a broken mirror, each tribe reflecting its own pride, its own pain, its own path. Loyalty was local, blood was everything. If you weren't part of the tribe, you were the enemy. The idea of unity, it was laughable. These were people who had been at each other's throats for generations, fighting over water, honor, stolen camels, and long forgotten slights. Each tribe had its own gods, its own rules, its own version of justice. There was no central authority, no common cause, no reason to come together, until something shifted. What entered wasn't just a religion, it was a revolution of thought. It said, you are one, not in name, not in race, but in faith, that your bond wasn't based on whose blood ran in your veins, but whose light lived in your heart. Suddenly, the lines that had kept people apart started to fade. The message didn't just preach peace, it demanded it. It didn't just allow unity, it insisted on it. People who once stood on opposite sides of war stood shoulder to shoulder in prayer, facing the same direction, speaking the same words, submitting to the same Creator. That kind of unity, it doesn't just heal wounds, it terrifies the powerful. Because when the scattered find common ground, when the broken link arms and move as one, they become something no empire can easily control. The Romans ruled with fear, the Persians ruled with force, but neither could fathom the strength of hearts bound together by belief. Unity gave the Muslims more than just numbers, it gave them momentum. And when people move in the same direction with the same purpose, walls fall. It wasn't perfect. They still had differences, still had conflicts, still had growing pains, but now they had something stronger than tribal pride to return to. They had a common moral compass, a shared set of values that reminded them, you are not alone. You are not in this for yourself. You are part of something sacred, and the world began to notice, because suddenly these desert dwellers weren't just surviving. They were building. They were organizing, strategizing, reaching beyond borders. What once was a divided patchwork of tribes was becoming a united front, a living force guided by purpose and protected by principles. It wasn't just the message of Islam that traveled. It was the spirit of unity it ignited. And the thing about unity is that it multiplies power. 10 scattered voices are noise, 10 united voices are thunder, and thunder shakes the sky. This wasn't the kind of strength forged in palaces or polished in war rooms. This was strength born in prayer, grown through patience, and held together by the belief that we are stronger together than we ever were apart. At a time when empires were drowning in indulgence, chasing pleasure like it was purpose, there rose a people who chose something different. While rulers wrapped themselves in silk, held feasts dripping with luxury, and lost themselves in their own reflection, the early Muslims were learning the power of restraint. They weren't chasing comfort. They were being carved by discipline. They weren't obsessed with being served. They were obsessed with serving something greater than themselves, and that difference, that choice to walk a harder road, became their strength. Every sunrise started with submission. Rising from warm beds before the world even stirred, they stood in quiet prayer, whispering words of surrender while the mighty still slept. They fasted, not for image, not for control, but to sharpen their souls. To teach their bodies that hunger doesn't destroy you, it deepens you. While others lost themselves in excess, they learned to lead themselves first, and that's the thing. Real power isn't about controlling others. It's about mastering yourself. It's about being the kind of person who can say no to what's easy, and yes to what's right. Discipline was the beating heart of this new movement. It wasn't about perfection. It was about consistency, about showing up even when it hurt, about praying not just when life was falling apart, but also when things were going well. It was about walking away from wealth that corrupted, from power that blinded, from temptations that promised comfort but delivered chains. While the world admired palaces, the Muslims admired character. While others flexed status, they flexed self-control, and it shook people because the world was watching this rise, watching these nobodies become somebodies, watching them walk with a calm that couldn't be bought, a fire that couldn't be faked. It made no sense to those who lived for gold, for gossip, for glory. How do you fight people who aren't scared to lose? How do you defeat those who have already surrendered to something higher? The Persians had palaces lined with jewels, but their leaders crumbled from within, eaten by greed, distracted by ego. The Romans had traditions older than memory, but their decadence hollowed them out. They had strength in numbers, but no spine in spirit. Meanwhile, the Muslims were building cities from dust and armies from devotion. They didn't need opulence to feel valuable. They had identity rooted in principle. They didn't fear hunger, they didn't fear sacrifice, because they knew what disciplines you defines you. Their strength didn't come from size. It came from the silence of early morning prayers, from the quiet power of holding their tongue, from the relentless pursuit of something bigger than the world's applause. That kind of strength doesn't march in parades. It grows in the dark, in private battles, in daily choices. It doesn't seek to impress, it seeks to impact. And while the world was looking for power in palaces, real power was being forged in the fire of self-control. In a world that glorified strength through sword and throne, something radical began to happen. A new kind of power emerged, not built on fear, not dependent on force, but rooted in knowledge. While others expanded their borders through conquest, the early Muslims expanded minds. In the midst of deserts and dust, they built centers of learning. In places the world had overlooked, libraries rose like monuments, not to kings, not to warriors, but to thought, and that shift, choosing books over blades, reshaped history in ways the so-called superpowers never saw coming. They didn't just collect knowledge, they protected it. When other civilizations let wisdom slip through the cracks of time, these believers held it close. They translated ancient Greek, Persian, Indian, and Roman texts, not to conquer the past, but to understand it, to build on it, to take it further. While the West drowned in what they called the Dark Ages, the Muslims were lighting lamps in every city, every corner, every heart that was willing to learn. They saw education not as luxury, but as worship. Not as privilege, but as responsibility. In Baghdad, the House of Wisdom stood like a lighthouse in a storm. Thinkers from different lands, different faiths, different tongues came together to ask questions the world had forgotten to ask. They weren't afraid of ideas, they welcomed them, they debated, discovered, and documented. Medicine, astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, chemistry, these weren't just subjects, they were sacred pursuits. Because they believed that every new truth uncovered was another sign of the Creator's brilliance, and that belief changed how they lived. Doctors developed surgical tools while the rest of the world relied on superstition. Mathematicians laid the groundwork for algorithms, for algebra, for equations that would one day power computers. Astronomers charted stars with a precision that stunned even future generations. And all of this, every discovery, every breakthrough, was driven by a single conviction: knowledge is power, and power must be pursued with purpose. The world didn't understand it. How could a people once dismissed as desert wanderers now be setting the intellectual pace of the planet? How could cities with no reputation become the envy of scholars everywhere? The answer wasn't magic. It wasn't coincidence. It was the result of a mindset, one that refused to accept ignorance as destiny. They didn't learn to impress, they learned to evolve, and while others measured greatness in territory and taxes, the Muslims measured it in transformation, of the mind, of the soul, of the community. The more they knew, the more they grew, and that growth didn't just stay in books. It turned into boldness, boldness to speak truth, to challenge tradition, to imagine futures no one dared to dream. Because when your mind is free, when your heart is led by knowledge and not noise, there is no limit to what you can build, no ceiling to what you can become. Power without justice always cracks from within. It doesn't matter how tall the walls are, how sharp the weapons, how loud the voices of authority. If the foundation is built on corruption, it won't stand, and that was the silent undoing of many empires that once seemed untouchable. The powerful ruled with arrogance. Justice was twisted to serve the privileged. The poor were forgotten. The weak were exploited. And slowly, the very people who once believed in the system began to lose faith in it. But then came a different model, one that said no one is above the law, one that held leaders accountable, one that brought justice from the hands of kings into the hands of the people, and it shook the world. The early Muslims were not perfect, but they were different. They believed justice wasn't something you applied when convenient. It was something you lived, something you protected, something you feared losing more than life itself. Because they knew that without justice, faith was hollow. They understood that God's mercy did not excuse human oppression, that leadership was a trust, not a throne, that power came with weight, and the moment it served ego instead of truth, it became dangerous. Rulers didn't stand above the people, they stood among them. The caliphs didn't hide behind gold curtains and guarded gates. They walked the streets, they listened to complaints, they accepted accountability, not as a threat, but as a test of their sincerity. Even the prophet himself made it clear, if his own daughter were to steal, justice would be applied. That kind of integrity doesn't just earn respect, it earns loyalty, because people can feel when they are being seen, heard, and valued. Justice was not just about punishing the guilty, it was about protecting the innocent, it was about building systems that prioritized fairness over favoritism. Judges were trained not to please kings, but to uphold truth. Testimonies were weighed carefully, rights were clearly defined. From property laws to family matters, the framework was built to prevent oppression before it began. And when the people saw that justice didn't depend on class or tribe or gender, they began to believe in something they'd never seen before * honest governance *, and that belief became a force. It spread. It crossed borders without swords. It reached hearts without speeches. People saw a model that worked and wanted to be part of it. They saw leaders who feared injustice more than invasion. They saw a system that treated the poor with dignity and the rich with humility. It was different, it was magnetic. While empires like Rome and Persia buried their problems under gold and titles, the early Muslims faced their issues with truth. They didn't pretend perfection, they pursued it. Not for praise, but because their faith demanded it, because they knew that if you want people to follow you, protect them. If you want people to trust you, be just. If you want to build something that outlasts you, build it on fairness. Not fear, they didn't have the numbers, they didn't have the weapons, they didn't have the global alliances, the war strategies etched in centuries of empire, building, or the gold reserves to fund massive campaigns. By every standard the world respected, they were supposed to lose. They were supposed to stay small, hidden, silent, but what they had couldn't be measured in resources. It lived in their hearts. It wasn't about muscle or money. It was about belief, a kind of belief that was deeper than motivation and stronger than fear. It was unshakable, unbreakable. It didn't rise and fall with emotions. It stood steady, through loss, through pain, through the impossible. And that is what made them unstoppable. Belief doesn't need approval. It doesn't wait for consensus. It moves in silence and proves itself in action. These early Muslims believed that they were part of something eternal, something divine. And that gave them courage that couldn't be taught in a classroom or drilled on a battlefield. It gave them patience when the odds said quit. It gave them focus when the distractions screamed louder. When they walked into battle, they weren't just fighting with swords. They were carrying purpose, and purpose doesn't flinch. Every sacrifice they made wasn't a loss, it was an offering. Every setback wasn't a defeat, it was a delay. That mindset, that's dangerous to the powerful, because you can't intimidate someone who doesn't fear death. You can't bribe someone who isn't obsessed with this world, and you definitely can't stop a community that believes their mission is bigger than their lifespan. This wasn't fanaticism, this was faith, grounded, intentional, transformative faith, a belief that what they were doing wasn't just for them, but for generations to come, that even if they didn't see the victory, their effort would echo. And it did. Time and again, history shows us that they were underestimated, written off, mocked, and yet, one by one, those same superpowers fell, not all at once, not without resistance, but eventually. Because they couldn't match that kind of resilience. They couldn't compete with that kind of clarity. When the Persians collapsed, when the Romans cracked, the world wasn't shocked by how fast the Muslims advanced. It was shocked by how deeply they were rooted, how ready they were to step in, not just as conquerors, but as carriers of a new way to live. Their belief wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, it didn't need to be. It showed up in their discipline, in their mercy, in their unity, in their justice, in the way they carried themselves when no one was watching. That kind of belief doesn't just move people, it moves history. And when belief becomes action, when faith becomes footsteps, the impossible becomes inevitable, not because of luck, not because of coincidence, but because hearts lit with conviction can do what empires built on arrogance never can. They endure, they inspire, they rise from the ashes and rewrite the rules. So here's what this story teaches us. You don't need to be born into power to change the world. You don't need riches to rise. You need faith. You need purpose. You need the courage to believe in what the world laughs at. The early Muslims didn't just defeat superpowers. They redefined what power means. And you carry that same potential. When you know who you are, when you believe in something beyond the moment, you become a force no one can silence. So stop waiting for the world to hand you your worth. Stand up, speak out, rise strong, because sometimes the ones written off in history become the ones who write it.